putting together the history of the impacts.
Here we go.
Now we're getting recorded. So this is a kind of a busy boat that you're looking at, but it's hopefully what we try to do is really look at the history of the impacts. And it includes economic, environmental, social, public policy, and technology. And if you look at this boat, you can notice, look at the bottom. I mean, it's a timeline going across from left to right. And you can kind of look at, there's some trends on what we looked at. Remember back in the late 80s and early 90s, we started getting really cruise ships. Well, the first thing we did was the noise was very, very bothersome. We had fixed wing airplanes going into the harbor. Remember how noisy those were? And we turned to technology and we said, we can kind of fix that. That'll improve. Then we said, what about those helicopters flying over residential areas? Well, we can try to fix that too. So we routed that. We had studies, the Baker study, if you remember. So first was kind of noise was coming back at us. And then it became air. What about that pollution that's coming out of the stacks? And so we started looking at air. And then we started looking at water. But we found out we didn't have a right to know what they were doing. So we had, because there was nothing in law to do that. So the state legislators, the local ones, state legislators, passed some regulations passed some state law that said, we have a right to know. And so we started to find out, and that became a starting point. So then we passed laws about wastewater discharge. And then the top part of this, that you really, it's kind of hard to read. And these slides will go up because we're going to shoot a lot of information at you, and there's no way we have enough time to go through this in any detail. So please look at it. But the top part is really the civic engagement. I'm interested in how this came about. Well, there was a lot of civic engagement that actually drove, as we've seen across the globe, civic engagement really drives regulation and concern and improvements, as well as industry. But that's where you'll see that in dark, there's civic engagement. So moving along, first we had noise, air, right to know, wastewater, and then revenue. Remember, we passed the passenger fee. We were one of the first communities to do that. We wanted some money to deal with the impacts. And now I would suggest that we're into capacity, all right? And that's the kind of the phase that we're in right now. So that kind of sets the stage in the history. And there's a lot of things that it's kind of an interesting kind of timeline to give you a sense of this. And we're going to go into some of those tonight. So I'm going to turn this over to Ed now.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, again, my name's Ed White. I think I was introduced as a former cruise ship program manager, worked there for a few years, but now been dealing more with national, international. So as we go through, one of the things I've liked working on this project with Jim is it's been more of a comparison. We're looking at what's been done in Juneau, what's been done other places, comparing those and looking at the standards. And as we go through those 5 communities, we've been looking at the environmental practices, some of the controls. Here in Juneau, we've got the tourism best management practices, been going for quite a while now. So that's sort of was a trendsetter. We've seen other communities adopting that. As we go through sort of different issues here with air, wastewater, noise, traffic. As we get into these reports, we'll be getting that more in detail. What we're going to show you tonight is more, like Jim said, just sort of a draft introductory thing, and more focused tonight a little bit more on Juneau and some of the other elements. But as we go through, I'll talk a little bit more in detail, mainly on air and wastewater. I think was one of our topics of focus, because there has been a lot of movement on that. And it'll be great with Ben here, knows probably a lot more about the recent wastewater developments and state standards. I'll go over a little bit more on what's going on with the international there. But it's interesting because each community sort of got a different layering, different approach. There's local, regional, national, the international standards come out, but a lot of those will be applying more to offshore international shipping. Also be talking more sometimes in general. I've been working more in general on shipping, not just cruise ships. So it's sort of interesting at the international level, trying to apply some of the things that have been applied to cruise ships on more other types of shipping. has been exciting to be at least sort of involved in a little bit of that with sewage. Anything you want to add, Jim, on this slide?
I was just going to say, these are the major impacts that we're looking at as far as environmental practices and controls. You'll notice that local, there's regional, national, and international controls. But local, you'll see a lot of best practices.
Yeah.
The locals here don't have a lot of authority to get into air or water. That's really governed by state, national, and international controls. But we can pressure, of course, and lobby, but that's set up in regulation and statute that way. So you can see how they differ at the local, regional, and different levels in the different ways that we're looking at things.
Okay. On to the next. Did you want to do this one?
Yeah. This is kind of a summary slide we came up with, just kind of what we're doing in these areas. Air and water, that's state and federal control, you might say, management. We've done the plug-in cruise ship. We're the first in the world to have a wastewater discharge. I think we can feel very good about that. And also this thing that's emerging, and that's called the Green Corridor, where communities collaborate together to deal with these issues. Visitors, we're dealing with that right now. I mean, we just had a ballot. We're not going to go into that ballot tonight. That's been done. I think it was certified today. I have a slide on that later in the presentation. But we have MOUs now that are addressing number of cruise ships. So that's a non-regulatory approach towards that. And over 90 TBMP specific things that we're trying to make those impacts of visitors on our community better. Then noise got better. We use technology, but it's still complaints. If you look at the hotlines, noise is a big thing. And I submit that it's because we have more people, just this whole volume is going up. And then Wales, that keeps coming up as far as what we're doing with that. And actually, they took it upon themselves. I don't know if you guys know, but the whaling charter organizations took it upon themselves to regulate themselves because there's nothing in federal, state, international law that regulates the number of ships around a cruise ship or around a whale. So they took that on. That's
Okay. I'll start talking a little bit about some of the environmental impacts from cruise ships. And a lot of them have different regulations or agreements to deal with these. Here in Alaska, a lot of work's been done on air emissions, wastewater, sewage, and gray water from ships has been a big focus both here and now in other parts of the world. If you go outside of Alaska, you'll hear a lot about invasive species, hull cleaning, ballast water, huge issues in many states and many parts of the world. And all of those have different rules and requirements. Solid waste and hazardous materials. This was an issue when I started with the program. One of my first things was cataloging the garbage coming off the ships, hazardous materials. Not a lot generated on the ships, but still they need to document, show how they're doing it. Fuels and oils, that is a big issue, especially now in the Arctic. There's a lot of concern with different fuel use, and we have the Polar Code that deals with some of that, what can be used. What we're finding as we're talking to people in different communities, the indirect from passengers can be a large impact. Think about all those people on shore. We interviewed Port of Nome this week or last week and talk about all the people that fly into town. It may be more of an impact than the ships in the port. So that's a thing people are looking at as well and concerned about. From other of our community meetings, we've heard about noise, light, disturbance of wildlife, as Jim was talking about the whale watching, all being concerns. And there's different mechanisms. I'll focus a little more on the air emissions and a bit on the wastewater, because those are examples where Alaska sort of did a lot of work early on, and we're seeing more work now being done around the world. And one of the interesting things as we were going through this, and I've noticed doing some work and a correspondence group, and occasionally going to I'll mention IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which sort of develops some of the treaties and international rules. Been doing some volunteer work and some paid work on that. But what's interesting is looking at international, talking with other countries, looking at what the United States as a nation, federal rules are. We have some differences, and these are generalizations that I go through here. Things are changing, but in Alaska, we see a lot more performance-based. So when we look at the air emissions, there's an opacity limit. That's how much of the air you can how much light's going through. So it's a visual test, but that's really a performance standard. Wastewater has set limits with sampling. If you go outside of Alaska to, looking at what the US federal rules are, sewage, or the international rules, it's certification focused. You get a piece of equipment, it's got a certificate, it's been tested in a lab as a type approval, and then it goes out into the field. So it's a little bit different process where we're looking at the discharges and emissions. A lot of the federal rules on air emissions and some of the international agreements are focused more on equipment and fuels. And sometimes that's because of how things are in the regulatory process. The state has authority on certain things. The federal government has authority on certain things. We've got treaty agreements on certain things. Alaska's really been focused on in the past on the air and the water quality on the environmental side. And some of our standards are based on human health. Outside of Alaska, and this is in last week, EPA put out the final standards for the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, setting some of those standards. They talk a lot about best available technology, what equipment can do versus the air water quality that we've been concerned about in Alaska. Some other differences, Alaska has been focused on compliance, inspections, checking things. We're finding in Europe, it's fun looking at what Norway does. They seem to be looking a lot more at incentives and also dock fees, trying to incentivize operators to do things better. Again, focusing on here in Alaska, sewage, gray water. There's no international standards for gray water. Alaska was really the first state to roll out for cruise ships any gray water standards, and still a big focus on that. And of course, air emissions have been big. Outside of Alaska, looking at like Europe, big focus right now, greenhouse gases, some of the air pollutants, the sulfur oxides, the nitrogen oxides, from all ships, not just specifically cruise ships. And again, I mentioned ballast water, a big issue. And I'll go through quickly some of the, in Alaska, again, like I mentioned, we have more performance-based standards. So ships need approval to discharge, depending on what size they are and where they are, sampling being required, discharge records, and sampling plans. There's work internationally to roll those out to all ships eventually. May have to do what some of them are doing in Alaska. Again, inspections, enforcement, improvement. We've seen some improvement in wastewater, considerable improvement back around 2000 to 2002. And I mentioned the sort of layering. One of the things that Jim and I talk about is a lot of things sort of get siloed. Different people are responsible for different things. If you look at Alaska, the responsibility is near shore often. Alaska is unique, where I have on the 3+ inside waters. If anyone remembers the donut holes, where ships were able to discharge beyond 3 miles, but within the islands here in Southeast Alaska, that got closed. So you need federal state approval and no untreated sewage in those waters. But many of the state requirements only go out 3 miles. The communities themselves, a lot of that's agreement based in the harbor. Here in Alaska, you need Coast Guard and state approval. We've got some pump outs for wastewater if ships need it. But once you go outside 3 miles, then you've got some federal and then later international standards. And beyond 12 miles, that's where really International standards come in, but the only ones really that are in place are for the rate of speed at which you can discharge raw sewage or sewage sludge. So there's differences there. Some of the companies will go way beyond what the requirements are, but it is sort of this layer thing. And when we look at the different communities, each country's got different set of rules, different sort of layering there. But sometimes these things sort of get siloed where city can do one thing, state can do another, federal can do another, international, trying to sort of harmonize some of these standards. I've been working with Dr. Wei Chen, who developed some of the wastewater treatment systems used in Alaska. So these are the systems that go onto cruise ships that treat the wastewater to a much higher standard than a traditional system would. And one of the things he likes to point out, and this is from some trade publications where we were running some ideas by, but he came up with an idea to show the difference. Alaska is really for wastewater got a permitting regime, he calls it. So you develop policies, there's legislation that in Alaska led to permitting, compliance monitoring, compliance assessment, enforcement, and then it feeds back. So when I was working on the permits, we had the 2008 general permit. The legislature changed some of the rules based on what we were getting back. And then that goes back sort of it's a continuous process. And the goal of that process is to protect the environment. What happens right now at the international level, and there's an attempt to change that to modify the sewage annex and make it a little bit more like Alaska, where there is some sampling, some compliance monitoring, some testing that'll hopefully feed back into future changes. But right now, there's sort of the policy and objectives. We got to treat wastewater, rules were issued, and then systems get approved in the lab. And what we found in Alaska, and they're finding in other parts of the world, is some of these early systems that were approved do not work well. They may work for a while, not always. But the goal for those is you get a certificate. And that same thing with engines. If you've seen, I think on cars, you got emissions testing is done on a type of car, a model of car, and then it gets a certificate and everyone should be good. Our system's more like where you have to go into the DMV and get your car checked. In Alaska, there was a significant improvement seen on sewage treatment, also on gray water treatment. The chart I have may be hard to read, but back in 2000, 2001, some of the sample results resembled raw sewage. The blue is the large cruise ships with the AWTS now, and then the orange is small cruise ships. So you had bacteria counts in the millions on some ships. Now, if you look at the bottom line, the blue on advanced wastewater treatment systems, the average is very low, sometimes a bit above the detection limit, but basically 1 to 2. And you're talking about going from initially the geomean was in the thousands, and many ships we recorded levels of millions. For small cruise ships, improvement, this is logarithmic, but still not to the same standards because they've been exempted because they can't put some of the equipment on board due to the cost or the weight. But overall, the trend has been a bit better. And in Alaska, it's been unique with a large amount of compliance assessment. Says the permit limits do happen, but that feeds back into the process. Some spills have been reported, but overall, there's been active monitoring in Alaska, which some other parts of the world, like for gray water, for example, there may be no monitoring of at all. I'll talk a little bit about air emissions too. I know that's a concern. What's interesting is, as Jim will show, sort of where we were scoring concerns at neighborhood meetings, and things have changed over the years, which is sort of interesting going into that. But air emissions you get from the burning of fuel for propulsion, electricity generation. Some ships have incinerators, which they'll use offshore. Boilers for heat. Sometimes we were getting exceedances of the state standards for ships on shore power because they were using boilers for heat and something had happened. And a concern, the emissions, we've got gases coming out of those, particulates, acids. What I really love is a picture on the bottom I used to have in my cubicle all the time, which is 1972. That's a DEC photo. The state was monitoring air emissions before I was born. So midsummer 1972, you can see a little bit of smoke there. Of course, it's still a concern, and I'll talk a little bit about tracking out the public complaints. But like wastewater, air is sort of layered. Outside of 200 miles, we got worldwide sulfur limits. There's new limits for low sulfur fuel or equivalent using scrubbers. 0 to 200 miles. Here in Juneau, we're inside the North America Emission Control Area. So you're talking 0.1% or an alternative, scrubbers. Doesn't cover all of the state, but covers much of North America. And then within 3 miles, we have the state limits, state regulations, and then in the harbor, we've got shore power available. The TMBP agreement covers a little bit about how ships need trying to minimize. And looking at public complaints, I went through the TMBP reported public complaints and the state published public complaints going back to 1992. You can see a very high level there. There was some enforcement. It dropped a bit. The legislature at one point said, put in a budget document, no more work on this. So there was no more work. EPA came in, I think 1999, and there were some substantial penalties there. The Commercial Passenger Environmental Protection Program, also known as the cruise ship program, got started soon after that. Started working on both air and water. The air's now been moved to Division of Air. But it is interesting. I often got questions when I worked for DEC, like, why do the numbers go up and down in public complaints? We didn't always have an idea. Sometimes there were reasons. Fuel prices. We noticed when fuel prices spiked, we've got more public complaints. Ships or technology changing. You will see 2017 a big spike, 2018 a big spike. That was when commissioning tests were underway for the exhaust gas scrubbers. So there was more water vapor coming up. There were testing going on. We got a lot of complaints. And there was also at the time, I don't know if you ever remember, there was ships what I think they called hot berthing, where the ships were in the harbor maneuvering, not anchored, and letting people off while they were waiting for a spot. So both of those probably contributed to that spike. Because of that, again, thinking about the permitting regime where concerns lead to action. Community air monitoring, Division of Air started doing a bit of that. And in 2019 to this group, there was a presentation on that. Of course, it dropped a lot with COVID, but it is sort of interesting to look at the history of the public complaints. And I would recommend, because Division of Air is not here, if you go to their community-based air monitoring, they did a pilot project. They did some work here in Juneau. They do have air monitors. Sometimes I like looking at seeing what the monitoring sites show. And you can get sometimes live data. So they've got some of the reports and more information there. And so some international developments on air. That was this month. Looks like they're going to get Canada up in the blues, going to get a new emission control area. Parts of Alaska don't, but Southeast Alaska is covered with the orange, the North America Emission Control Area for low sulfur fuels. And greenhouse gases, I decided to put a little bit in here because of the group here. This is a large international topic and a lot of work is going on at the international level. I know in the past, not much has been done at the state level, but there is concern, large amount of fuel burned on ships. Cruise ships have a disadvantage where they use more energy in port than like a container ship. Shore power's been one of the solutions. Cruise lines have been doing a lot of work on energy efficiency, looking into long-term transition, alternative fuels. But again, cruise ships have some unique challenges. some of the different alternative fuels might bring about safety concerns. So it may be harder to get permitted for that from, a certification standpoint. Another thing that's going on been a lot of talk about slow sailing for ships. And this is another thing that may be difficult here in Alaska because of our distances. Slow sailing means you're burning less fuel, but if you're a cruise ship, you've got more hotel load. And then you're here in Alaska, that would mean probably cutting port time or port visits if that were to happen. So internationally, there's some goals, a whole lot of studies going on. Like everything else, when you get a lot of people together, it's easier to agree on studies. But the current goals are 2030 internationally for all shipping, 30% reduction of annual greenhouse gas emissions, 2040, 70 to 80%, and by around 2050, net zero. So there's a lot of talk going on at definitions. I'm not really the expert at all on the greenhouse gases, but a lot of work going on both in Europe, internationally. The US has been working with this at IMO. One of the things in the news too is there's been some local around the world, local developments. Norway has zero emissions they're going to be phasing in for World Heritage fjords. That's been delayed recently for large ships to 2032, but 2026 for ships under 10,000 tons. And that's going to be a major development. You can imagine having a small vessel going up into those fjords. That's going to be a real change. You can go to IMO and read a little bit more about their latest plans, studies. They're collecting fuel data from ships. So there's a lot of work going underway and on that. And then the final, just quickly too, there's also work that was going underway this month on exhaust gas cleaning systems, scrubbers, both at the international level and at the federal level. So I'm not really an expert on scrubbers. A lot of what's going on is chemical. I like more of the biological type stuff, like the sewage and the gray water. But scrubbers have definitely been in the news. And this is for all ships, not just cruise ships that are using scrubbers. So they're allowed as a alternative to using low sulfur fuels. Open loop scrubbers use seawater. This is a photo from one of the commissioning tests. So you do get some discoloration of the water at times. pH has been an issue. Here in Alaska, we've seen foam and sheens. There's a much larger rate of wastewater discharge. That's one of the reasons that there's been focus on scrubbers. A recent report I read was at 90 cubic meters. That's cubic meters, about a ton of wastewater from a closed or open loop scrubber per kilowatt hour. So this can be significantly add up if you're using megawatts. And so there's been work done, studies underway by the cruise lines, by academics, trying to figure out what the impacts are. In the United States, there was a law to remove some of the state authority on regulations for things like scrubbers. The final rules for the standards were released last week. They seem to relax the pH standards. People are still looking at those and what can be done. The Coast Guard's going to have to do the implementation regulations. Worldwide, about 80 ports and regions have banned scrubbers, but again, in the United States, there may be limitations on that, and sometimes that might be shifting pollution to other places. Again, this is for all ships, not just cruise ships, but studies underway by NGOs, by academics and countries, cruise lines. So they're trying to report to IMO and to other agencies and to the public what they're finding. And IMO's been working on revising the testing guidelines. And I think the news last week was they're still open to gathering more information. So on scrubbers, it's been more of an information gathering, but there's definitely been public concern on those. So that's on to the neighborhood association.
There's a lot there. And again, this is on a PowerPoint that will be available on the site, so you can get into that stuff. And Ed and I are both on this for the next year for sure, trying to sort these things out. So I'm going to turn now to, we've talked about the environmental and also some of the technical, and I'm going to turn to some of the social parts. And what we look at are some of the data, and the data is qualitative. Some of it's survey data, hotlines, and also neighborhood association meetings. Some of you attended those meetings out here. Thank you for going to those and expressing your opinions. Back in 2019, we had a meeting and we ranked. We asked ourselves, okay, let's rank the negative concerns and the positive concerns. And you can see how they were ranked. 2024 in February, this past February, asked the same question. However, we did it in a little different way, and I'll go into that a little. What is interesting as a researcher for me, the priorities changed. Noise went up, overcrowding kind of stayed the same. You know, we're still concerned about that. Whale watching went down just a little, and you can see some of the other things there. I'm going to go to another slide that looks at it in a slightly different way. Thanks. On the left is, again, the 2019 Neighborhood Association, and we asked people to rank it in this way. What are your worst issues? Okay, and that's how those are ranked. On the 2024, we ranked them as in a different way. How many neighborhood associations think this particular issue, and we're basing it on those 9 issues. That's what we asked them to do. Okay. How many think those are at issue? So I kind of tallied up 10, and that was the biggest issue, was noise. And noise, I would suspect it has something to do with capacity and number of people, because we did reduce the noise in some ways through technology and rerouting helicopters. So that was the biggest thing. Overcrowding, still up there. 8 neighborhood associations said that's a big thing. And then whales, lack of control, government control, is government doing what it should be doing, kind of thing. And then helicopter noise. But what was interesting about this was before, this is the improvement, air pollution and water pollution technically and testing wise went down. We have data that says it's improving. Well, also the perception was it went down. So that's a good news. People think it went down. They also, the science supports that. So that was an interesting finding to researchers. Another way of looking at this, the neighborhood associations, where is the impact felt the most serious, the hardest? So out of 9 areas of impact, West Juneau said all of the issues are worse. All of the 9 issues have got worse. North Douglas, 7 out of 9, they got worse, except air, water stayed the same. Okay, not a big thing. Thane, all worse except air, water, and noise. Airport, 3 out of got worse except air. And then 5 out of 9, and then 4 out of 9 shelter islands. So these are the top areas. So we know a little about, and just a hint of information about where the impacts are and what the impacts are and what residents think. And then going to surveys. And there's surveys we've done, actually it's the McKinley group, and this came right from the McKinley Resource Group. And they've done surveys over many years, but I looked at their data to see how it corresponded with the neighborhood association data, and it corresponded. If you can see on this, crowding at the glacier, crowding at sidewalks, vehicle congestion are all going up. Okay, that's gone up. And you can see how these are grouped here, and the numbers correspond to the numbers on the previous slide. So there is a corresponding, it corresponds. And then lastly, and this just happened, and this actually got certified today, and this was the unofficial results, but I bet it's about the same. Usually, the difference between an unofficial results and the official results, you don't change. The trends just get bigger. This was interesting to me. We have all these precincts in town where we vote, and we have, I think it's 11 or 12 precincts, maybe 13. And then out of all of them voted against the proposition except 2. Those were Lynn Canal, and you could maybe think maybe you could see whales from Lynn Canal, okay? People living on the shoreline. And also Juneau #2 downtown. They voted for the ship-free day. And to show you where those precincts are, because I had to look up myself, you can see that it's out by the, out where charters go. And then also downtown, of course, that's where the ships are. And then also another, and this came out, this was 2023, crowding again, to take a look at that survey, because that was well done. They do some pretty good work. So just to show you what they came up with and the big issues. And again, it's crowding, it's number of people. So and then I have one more slide. TPMP. And they were really responsive to me and asking, they've been very good about getting data back to me. And I asked them just a few days ago, what's your data so far as complaints for this year in 2024? And you can see aircraft was the highest, 74 complaints, vehicle 73, whale watching 23, noise 14, and emissions is down. Okay, so that, if you can see some trends and triangulate some of that data, I think, to be sure. So the long and the short, as we're going forward with writing up some of the data and other things that we've learned, we're going to come out with 4 different papers, and we'd like to present those maybe sometime next year. We're writing up the papers now. It takes a long time to write the paper, do the analysis, and get it published in a respectful scientific journal. But that's why I'd like to come back to you. I think that our data shows, just to summarize real quickly, the environmental issues are going down. Still issues. I mean, we're still dealing, now we got scrubbers we're dealing with, and there's still issues out there, but we've improved dramatically in that area. But it's the capacity. I mean, we've got to get to where those impacts are, and we're going to do a paper on that. And there's methods of doing that. And anyway, in the governance, I think we can be proud of ourselves that we've done a lot, but we need to do a lot. We've been impacted heavily, but we've done a lot in town, so we can feel good about some of the things that we've done. And I think I'll end there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, did we have questions?
Ben?
Do you have a presentation or? Yeah.
I don't have a set presentation. I just kind of wanted to talk about what the program does now as far as compliance.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, thanks. I did want to talk about what the program does now, just in terms of compliance. And I know I was introduced earlier tonight. I did just want to say my name is Ben Eisenstein. I'm with the DEC, but I did want to add that qualifier. It had kind of mentioned this, that the program used to be kind of all encompassing, and the program has kind of split to a few very different areas. So I'm in the division of water, and specifically in the compliance division. So I kind of wanted to talk about what we do. We're kind of a hot topic, so I'd just like to, let everyone know what we're out there doing. Ed also mentioned this. So going into wastewater split into some of it's regulated by us. There are some things that are also regulated federally. But basically, for any vessel that operates in Alaska, any commercial passenger vessel, we kind of split them up based on their size. Anything that's less than 250 passengers overnight, like overnight berths, we consider that a small vessel. And anything that's over 250, we consider that a large vessel. And basically, those are kind of the two categories that we use to kind of, for some of the distinctions. For any large vessels that would like to discharge in Alaska, they need a very specific permit with us. And a part of that permit that Ed already mentioned, they get regular sampling, and they also get regular inspections by us. So all of the vessels that operate here in Alaska will get inspections from small commercial passenger vessels, large commercial passenger vessels, all get inspections by us, but the ones that discharge get a little further scrutiny. They get underway inspections. So we're out there to, like Ed had mentioned, to monitor for compliance. He mentioned that there's the big distinction here about you not only have to have equipment that has worked at some point, you have to prove to us that it's working all the time that you're up here. So that's kind of that distinction. One of the other things that we use, so for any large vessel they have to submit monthly data to us. So we're reviewing discharge logs, and that's for every vessel. Some vessels choose not to discharge. For some of the vessels have older systems that can't meet our criteria. Our criteria is a lot stricter than US Coast Guard criteria. So some of those vessels will choose to hold all of their wastewater. And if you go back to Ed's slide, about 10 slides back where he had the different bubbles, and they go just outside of 12, and that's just kind of outside of our jurisdiction. So some vessels choose to operate that way. Some vessels choose to comply with those strict standards we have. And that's what we're doing to make sure that they are complying. We're out there, they sample twice a month. They get inspected by us. We check they submit hourly GPS positions to us, and most of them submit them actually on a minute by minute basis to us. And so we review all their discharge logs, double check that with the points where they were when they say they were at. And they also submit to us all of their sample results on a monthly basis that we also review. So yeah, I'd just like to say that we are out there doing those inspections. I also like to mention, because I get asked this a lot, we have a new kind of way in which the reporting is done to us. So we have a new electronic system, and if you are ever curious, if you go to your My Alaska and you scroll all the way down, there's a link, and it's just for the environmental data management system. And so any data that cruise ships give us, and whether you're just curious to see what a discharge log looks like, or their monthly data looks like, or inspection reports, anything that we have on those cruise ships is available for anyone to look at. And that's how you access it. You just go down there, click on it, click on the cruise ship, and they're able to see all that. So I just kind of like to give a brief overview of what we do, and then just kind of be here for questions.
Gunashish, thank you very much for presenting. We'll do some Q&A now. We have some questions in the chat from Zoom, and we'll take questions in the room. I have to repeat the questions into the microphone to make sure that people watching online can hear. So I will try to repeat your question faithfully, but if you need to correct me, go on ahead. I will start with one from the Zoom, and then we'll go to you if that's all right. Let's see, Carla Hart asks, Ed White, is there any published science that links opacity used for air quality monitoring in Alaska to human health? Is opacity protective? Is the opacity measure indicating something protective of human health in a concrete way? And there's a follow-up after that.
Yeah, and as far as my understanding with the opacity standard is it's a not directly linked, it's an indicator. So it's been used going back to the, okay.
Yeah.
There we go. So it's been going back to, actually, I think the 20% state standard goes back to Europe in about the 1880s, 1890s. Anyway, it's a performance standard for how well combustion is going. But it's not directly linked, because opacity can be several things mixed in. So you've got maybe particulates, gases, other things, and not knowing what is in that. That's why there's often more monitoring of different things. I know the state, some of those community monitors that they installed are looking at things like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, some of the other, and particulates. And some of those do, there's been some research done. I think Port of Victoria did some studies down in that area. Several European cities have as well. The problem often is figuring out what's from the ships and what's the background. We've been fortunate here in Juneau. We have relatively clean air overall, is what the sensors seem to be showing, and unless we get wildfire smoke. But the sensors may not always be at the best spot, so you may get localized. But going back to the question, opacity is not a direct human health. It's more of an indicator on the performance. If you're over 20%, the idea is that you're not burning fuel correctly. And that's where the standard comes from. So it is a performance standard, just not linked to human health. Then we look into other things. But the idea was, if you see a lot of opacity, there may be other problems.
Okay. The follow-up question to that is it a challenge given Juneau's weather conditions and lighting angles much of the time as far as monitoring?
The short answer is yes. Yeah, I used to do a lot of readings out there, and it can get difficult. But that's one of the reasons I think when you look at the readings on the community monitors, why our air tends to be cleaner than some of the other ports, is that the rain will wash things out. One thing though we've had challenge on, I remember with the scrubbers, was often because you're using seawater, the emissions aren't rising as much. Sometimes we had what we called collapsing plumes. We also had inversions here in Juneau. Conditions like that make it difficult. They have the same in Tracy Arm and Glacier Bay. So reading can be difficult, and sun angles too, with the mountains around in Alaska. Getting the right sun angle. The opacity standard was designed, I believe, in California. So they apparently have more sun down there. But since it is an EPA standard now, it was what we were using because it's an easy test to make. And then you can follow that up, getting data from the ship or, again, the community monitoring.
The question concerning the use of scrubbers is a more of an economic question for the cruise lines. Having the government require them to use cleaner fuels would eliminate the need for discussion of using scrubbers.
The question was regarding scrubbers, that if the government were to mandate cleaner fuels as opposed to making it an option, then scrubbers, would those be eliminated from?
Yeah, not really as much an expert on scrubbers, but they're used often as an alternative internationally by ships. So there are standards for low sulfur fuel use, although governments have given scrubbers as a alternative. So by using the scrubbers, you're reducing the sulfur dioxide and hopefully the particulates and other things coming out. But there has been some talk. I know Arctic, what I guess we call the high Arctic, because of concern about heavy fuel oil. There's been some movement to push lighter fuels, low sulfur fuels that are easier to clean up if you have a spill. And some of that may eliminate scrubbers as an alternative in some of those. So it is something that I know EPA has been working on, others working on, and again, about 80 places have banned the use. Yeah.
Would you mind, for those of us who are arts majors, would you mind giving me just a very brief narrative about, like, so a scrubber removes particulates from the plume, but then what happens that winds up putting it into the water, or how does that
Yeah.
process?
There's a lot of different methods, technologies. The ones that I've observed being used, some of them are sort of a closed loop, so they're using internally, cleaning the water out, using chemicals to take the acids out. So you get some that will discharge very little water, or some cases no water, some types. Open loop scrubbers are using seawater to neutralize the acids, and then there's usually a filtration system to remove some of the particulates from the water, and then there's requirements for testing. So they have to test things like metals and for oils, things like that, and often a lot of mixing to get the pH to the right level. So there's several different types. And it does get a bit confusing looking at them. So some ships may not be discharging any scrubber water in Alaskan waters if they use these. Some choose not to use them in different ports. I know Juneau in particular and Skagway, we've seen more issues that might be related to water temperature and alkalinity of our water, and our water being a lot of glacier fresh water. But yeah, there's different types. I don't really know a good way to explain, but a lot of them use sort of a centrifuge to try to remove particulates before, and there are standards before they can discharge the water. But the concern is the volume, and if anything goes wrong with that process, and that's why they usually monitored by some sort of system.
If they're removing pollutants from their air discharge, essentially using water and rinsing, what happens to the waste once they have expelled the water? I would assume you'd be left with something, toxic. What do
Yeah,
they do with that usually?
The sludge is offloaded. I believe it was often in like Vancouver, Victoria, Canada, or Seattle.
Okay.
So there's sludge that is removed, especially the closed loop systems. They produce like a gypsum sludge, like if you think a wet drywall is what it looks like. Yeah, there's often some sort of offload or putting any oily water into tanks, sludge into tanks. So there's some watching of that, but again, the regulations are still being updated. The monitoring's being updated, I know, at the international level. Any new, wouldn't call it a new technology because it's been used on land for quite a while, but there's sometimes like what we saw in 2016 to 2018, a lot of commissioning tests where they were installing, trying things out and trying to improve the treatment. Is that?
Do you have a follow-up?
That's what I'm wondering about. You're using scrubbers to take the pollution out, but is it changing the form and being emitted as wastewater instead?
Yeah, that's the question is, so they're taking pollution out of the air pollution stream, but is a portion of it being emitted as wastewater instead, essentially?
Yeah, well, with the sulfur acids and things like that, as I understand it, what you have is you're neutralizing some of those acids. So sulfur dioxide turns into acid rain, can cause health problems. By putting it into the water and neutralizing it, you're neutralizing some of those acids, which may not be like a direct pollutant in a way, but the concern all this is for some of the ports has been with the pH. You're basically using seawater to neutralize those acids. Some of the manufacturers argue that that would be going on land and then being neutralized in another way, eventually ending up in the water. Yeah.
It's either you don't use the dirty fuel and you use this pollution creation device, which is what a scrubber is. It creates pollution out of dirty
Yeah.
fuel, or you use clean fuel and you don't create the additional pollution. So a scrubber only creates additional pollution. The question is whether it's an open loop scrubber that's discharging these incredibly large volumes into our inside waters that at every moment it's being used, or it's a closed loop scrubber, which is creating a smaller, very toxic amount of bleed off that's then being discharged outside of our waters.
All right, I'm going to do my best to repeat that so folks online can hear. Yeah, the clarification was essentially the pollution is still occurring from the fuels. It's only a question of whether it's because the fuels being used are dirty compared to the low sulfur fuels. The question is whether the pollution that is in those fuels is being put through an open loop scrubber and essentially put back into the water, or going through a closed loop scrubber and being disposed of somewhere on land later. Nope, I did not get that right. I'm sorry. Yeah, if you're
Okay.
open to it.
Thanks. I just really wanted to clarify that
Yeah.
it's not a question of whether it's a question of whether the pollution is created or not. A scrubber allows the creation of this pollution. It's the wastewater from an open loop scrubber that's created has to be used. It's created continuously if the scrubber is being used. So some of these vessels, all of the Carnival Corporation vessels use open loop scrubbers. So they're the worst offenders in terms of creating this new source of pollution into our Alaska waters. Anytime one of those scrubbers is operating one of its scrubber equipped diesel units, it's generating up to, I heard 90 cubic meters per kilowatt hour. I did some back of the napkin math on those, like the Discovery, for instance, has two 14.4 kilowatt engines, two 16.8 kilowatt engines. If they're all operating together, that's 5,616 cubic meters of scrubber polluted water that ship is generating every hour. Now, if it were to operate 24 hours on an Alaska run, that would be about its own volume, about 6 times of. So just to give you a little bit of perspective. So the question is, in what type of scrubber is being used, whether it's an open loop one discharging into our inside waters, or a closed loop one that can hold the water, which is highly toxic bleed off water that's too toxic to continue to be used. They're adding this caustic acid in, or soda in, or acid into it, soda, sorry. And then they hold that and they dump it, they still dump it in the ocean. They dump it offshore.
And it does get really confusing. Just to clarify a bit, scrubbers, I was talking about sort of some of the differences there. We also have ships, I know here in Juneau, that have used the scrubbers on low sulfur fuel. Don't know why, but that was their choice, I guess, maybe to remove some of those particulates. We also have, if you look at some of the Ocean Range reporting and Division of Air reporting, ships have a mix. So they might have some engines on low sulfur fuel, some engines on scrubbers, maybe for propulsion. So it does get complicated because you have different technologies being used, different devices being used. But the low sulfur rules that came about, was about 2015, and then some more rules later on. So those were to reduce the impacts in ports internationally, and then the scrubbers were used as sort of an alternative to that. If that, I don't know if that helped at all.
This is a follow-up question to the scrubbers and talking about regulation. And you mentioned earlier, Jim, that some regulations of different sorts, not necessarily scrubbers, are city or state or national, Coast Guard, international. Where does the scrubber pollution regulation responsibility lie in Alaska?
Right now,
Could you incorporate the question in?
yeah, the question was on, you know, sort of as we talked about things being siloed and who's responsible where. For the exhaust gas cleaning systems, the scrubbers, most of that in 2018 was federalized. States can apply, I think, for no discharge zones, for other standards. But at one time, states were working on this. I remember we were drafting a permit thinking about including scrubbers at one point in our gray water and sewage permit. But the federal law sort of took a lot of that authority away. The federal law matches many of the international standards which were developed. They try to sort of synchronize things there. So for the exhaust gas scrubbers, it's often here in the United States, been more federals developing the standards there. There are some no discharge zones in the US, I believe Canada, I think Connecticut. Some of these have been established. So that is an option for areas to apply for that. But yeah, I'm sure the new standards, I keep getting a feeling that those will end up in court at one time or another, like many other federal laws, wherever federal laws sort of take some of the local authority away there. But we've seen some ports sort of also enter into voluntary and other agreements, mainly those that own the docks. And that becomes a difficult thing if you have private docks. But yeah, right now with the exhaust gas cleaning systems, the scrubbers, there's some international agreements, and then a lot of it's sort of been federalized, which makes it difficult at the state level. Although states can still, I believe, apply for no discharge zones and ask EPA for other things. So that's, I think, under development now.
You might if
Yeah,
I
go
jump
ahead,
in and
Jim.
just throw one comment in there. One thing Ed had mentioned VITA, that the VITA standards came out very recently, and so VITA, we didn't really touch on this too much. It's a Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, and exhaust gas scrubbers are covered under VITA, and so basically the permit writers for VITA have said that VITA, the national standards, will essentially cancel out any state standards. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah,
Sometime in the future.
sometime in the future, yeah. Yeah, Coast Guard has to develop those. There's vessel general permit standards in place now. I do want to add also on the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act did nationalize some of the standards for things like ballast water and other things. We were very fortunate. Alaska's congressional delegation was able to save the gray water. So we're still able to do the sewage and gray water under the bill. It's one of the only carve outs, I think, for any state. Which was fortunate, but we were not able to get that for some of the other discharges.
So it sounds like, is there any federal legislation being considered to, force these operators to use the cleanest fuel available?
Is there any,
Because by using that, you don't have to have the question about using scrubbers.
is there federal legislation or action likely or being considered that would compel the use of cleaner fuels, making scrubbers unnecessary?
Yeah, I'm not aware of on the federal side. I know internationally, there's been some work being done. Again, like I mentioned with the Arctic, fuel standards. They're also working on black carbon, working on some ways to keep black carbon from ships. Again, this is ships in general, not just cruise ships. So internationally, I think there's some work, but I'm not aware of at the federal level right now.
I have
As-
follow-up from Zoom on the black
Okay.
carbon question. Carla Hart comments that if ships are not burning heavy fuel oil, they're able to install particulate filters that would substantially reduce black carbon and other particulates. The volume of black carbon with burning of heavy fuel oil precludes use of those filters. Thus, even when burning cleaner fuel in port, we are subject to higher levels of health-harming particulates. That is the comment. I'm a little bit
Okay.
not quite clear on precludes in that sentence, but the question I suppose is about when burning cleaner fuel, we are subject to higher levels of health harming particulates. Is that something that you have a comment on or
I'm a bit confused. I do know there's many different technologies out there. I know many of the ships monitor their emissions as well. But I'm not sure if I could speak for on that. Or I'm a little confused, I think. Sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I believe Aaron meant to say megawatt hours.
Yeah.
Cubic meters of discharge per megawatt hour, not kilowatts. Question.
There's a brief correction. I'm just gonna say into the microphone for Zoom that the amount of, what was it, 9 cubic-
It's, yeah, for modeling, it was a paper done for modeling. It was, I believe, 90 cubic meters per kilowatt hour. So that's over an hour of time. And that would be, I believe, for propulsion. So ships in general, some ships will
Yeah.
have more. And then some of that water will be used not for the exhaust gas cleaning system, but for wash water for neutralizing some of the acids. So mixing, some of that'll be sort of a mixing water, I
And
believe.
could you clarify, was that per kilowatt hour or per megawatt hour? Because that's quite
Per
different.
kilowatt hour.
Per-
So it, yeah, can add up.
We have a disagreement about that from the audience, but
Megawatt, not per kilowatt. Engines are rated in megawatts on the ship.
Yes.
That's what that unit of energy.
Yeah, this was for, although all ships, so it's covering smaller vessels as well that, yeah, I know that's why we need to, I think, convert that, but, yeah. On that.
So a general question for the panel and for Aaron, who has considerable expertise. Do scrubbers have any effect on greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of fossil fuels?
the question is, go ahead, continue, sorry.
Parts of engine exhaust, so that the public believes that the ships are somehow cleaner.
Mhm.
Is
That's-
it greenwashing?
That's a very good question. Are scrubbers actually removing harmful chemicals and particulates from
Visible.
including invisible ones?
Yeah.
Or are they merely removing visible particulates so that it appears to be a cleaner air discharge?
Yeah, they're not really designed on greenhouse gases. I will say it's sort of interesting if you saw the public complaints. We had a spike in public complaints when they started being used. The emissions appeared to be more visible, especially with the testing. But they're not designed. They're mainly designed for the sulfur, nitrogen, other oxides, so acids. But not for reducing greenhouse gases. And that's one of the things as part of the studies where people look at they're using energy. So then you got to figure out, is that saving energy by the fuel that you're using or not? And I don't have enough knowledge on that, but they're generally not designed on greenhouse gases. They're for reducing the sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, other things that we're more of a health concern, which is what led to the development of some of these sulfur, sort of low sulfur rules or alternatives.
As a follow-up question, in some of the monitoring that's currently done in Juneau, is there monitoring for greenhouse gas emissions, or is it primarily for these kind of health concern?
That you would need to
chemical.
check with Division of Air. From what I remember working on the monitoring, it was mainly for particulates, the SOx, the sulfur oxides, and the particulates that were looked at. I have seen some monitors worldwide looking, but I don't know if you'd be able to measure CO2. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, but I've seen that once or twice. I've seen some with CO, carbon monoxide, but I believe Alaska, we were focused on sulfur dioxide and particulates.
There's no need to measure greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
Because we know that for every gallon of fossil fuel, we generate 20 pounds of CO2, which will
Yeah.
be emitted into the atmosphere. There is nothing on the ships that will be able to capture that.
Yeah.
And if they captured it, there's no place to put it. So those greenhouse gas emissions will happen.
Yeah.
And they're imperceptible. Key word you both used, both Ed and Jim, was perception. So you can't perceive greenhouse gas emissions, whether you're a public or anyone else, because they're invisible.
Can
So
you
the
incorporate that
major-
into your answer?
The major missing link here is the effect of whole industry, greenhouse gas emissions, therefore on global climate change, which we're finally realizing is something of an emergency.
Yeah,
That's part of our agenda.
Yes, I absolutely agree. The question was greenhouse gas emissions are,
Yeah.
can you incorporate the question into your answer?
Yeah, the question was on
Um,
greenhouse gas emissions. As I understand it, yeah, it's not something that we really perceive. It's not something measured on the ships. Yeah, I mean, we can measure it from the fuel. That's what IMO right now, and some of the Arctic nations are collecting fuel use data because you can calculate from that. But it's difficult to measure in the communities. It's not something that we see like the visible emissions. The opacity is easy to see. But that's why I know at the international level and recently the United States has been more involved at IMO in working on greenhouse gases. It's the big topic, I think, now. Unfortunately, I think internationally, nationally, everywhere else have been a little bit slow on that. You know, you look at Alaska, the focus was on visible emissions very early on, going back the opacity standards from what, 1972. Yeah, greenhouse gases were not, I know when I was working in DEC, it was generally not a topic that was looked at or focused. And so that's one of the reasons we added it on the presentation here, talk a little bit about some of the updates internationally.
Yeah, Jim, some of your slides had greenhouse gas sort of goals set by other
Yeah.
countries essentially or
Mhm.
internationally. Could you comment a little bit on what or just refresh people's minds as to what some of those were?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, and not only does the internationally, but also several of the cruise lines, CLIA have standards, I know, in greenhouse gases. I think it was, the goal is, which is sort of nebulous, on or about 2050 to be greenhouse gas free, or no, what is it? No net zero emissions. And of course, they got to figure out all the definitions. 2030 is, I believe, a 20 to 30% reduction. And this is not just cruise ships, this industry wide, ships over 400 tons, cargo ships, oil tankers, all of that is a goal. And then the question becomes, what do you do as an enforcement mechanism for that? Things like that, I think on the next slide. And then 2040, 70 to 80% reduction of greenhouse gases. So there's been work underway, the cruise lines have been doing with IMO and some of the others for going back to the late 90s on energy efficiency to address a bit of that, but it's yeah. So it's all future reductions right now, I believe. but 20 to 30% reduction by 2030. And these are goals. And then 2040, 70 to 80% reduction worldwide for all ships. And then by around 2050 net zero. And of course, these are, I know, hotly debated. So there's going to be, I think, a big meeting in June, I think in Germany, and a lot of other meetings coming up international level to go over the specifics and work more on this.
Steve?
I had a follow-up comment, and question maybe. would be,
Can you take
Bill-
pauses so I can repeat it?
Yeah, well, following on Bill's point about greenhouse gas emissions being invisible, and your point about most of what you've been focused on is public perceptions. So I just wanted to provide a little context about Juneau's, about the cruise ship emissions in Juneau, greenhouse gas emissions in Juneau. So Renewable Juneau, that I'm part of, did an analysis this past year that said they found in 2023, the 37 cruise ships that parked here in Juneau.
Renewable Juneau did a study in 2023 that found of the 37 cruise ships parked here in Juneau,
They operated their generators for about 6,250 hours.
operated their generators for about 6,250 hours total during the length of the study.
And running standard, and I don't have the number, but what the standard generator emissions per hour would be, but the total calculation, it was about 42,000 metric tons of carbon.
Their calculation was that added up to about 42,000 metric tons of carbon emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions.
Which totals about 13% of the total greenhouse gas emissions that Juneau creates.
Which is about 13% of Juneau's total greenhouse gas emissions,
About 300,000 tons.
which is in the neighborhood of 300,000 tons annually. That's exactly what I was going to ask. I remember that study took place last year to give us a first benchmark for us to understand Juneau's greenhouse gas emissions. Do you recall where we can refer people to see the results of that study?
It's Renewable Juneau has.
Renewable
spread it
Juneau.
around- Renewable Juneau has spread it around
Mhm.
a number of people, and the set
Mhm.
of people, they can contact me if they want.
All right, all
I'll
right.
Send them the spreadsheet that has the names of all the ships, how long they spent in port. And actually had it for 2022 and 2023. You have a website for that? Don't have a website at the moment, but I can send it a.
I believe we,
Posted in the chat.
it's already, all right, good.
Email
Mhm.
jcost@juneau.gov, we can get some.
All right, yes, if you email jcos@juneau.gov, I know that we have had those, they are uploaded to the city's website in past, for example, meeting packets, but can hopefully highlight that a little bit better. The goal is to ultimately have a community dashboard that makes it easier for citizens to see not only that survey that was done, but also over time, hopefully track progress as we can get ideally repeat surveys done so we know which direction things are going.
And I would like to add too, we didn't talk too much about shore power, but that's another place where Juneau is sort of in the forefront of, when we talk about emissions, that having the shore power available here in Juneau and many other parts of the world now are rolling out more and more shore power. Initially, they had difficulty because the ships are so large, some of the smaller ports, but it is good to see a lot more shore power development, especially. I know that's somewhat limited here in Juneau, but didn't talk about it much in a presentation, but it is something that in our papers we've been going into a bit on the shore power.
That's right. Let's see. We have just about 5 minutes left. 6 minutes. Yeah. All right. And was there a follow-up question there?
Can I assume that the discharge from the open scrubber waste water is toxic to our health?
Is discharge water from scrubbers toxic?
That's undergoing study right now. I know there was a Puget Sound study by the cruise lines that had one answer, a study in Finland that had a very different answer. The concern is some of the elements in it can be toxic. So you've got metals, what they call PAHs, which are hydrocarbons. So there are materials in there. And that's where I think on the federal side, looking at the monitoring, the limits, there even is on EPA, the Vessel General Permit site. Sometimes you can download their annual reports and some of the sampling that's been done. But yeah, that's where there is concern because some of the materials coming out of that. And I think that's where some of the studies are underway. I know of one study going on now that's going to be looking at what are from all ships, not just cruise ships, but up in the Arctic, what are the discharge volumes? What, if you calculate that out by the sampling that's been done, how many pounds of copper, how many pounds of nickel, zinc, vanadium, some of the other heavy metals and the other things are going into the waters. I think there's been some studies in the Baltic. I recently saw a report by Pacific Environment. Some of the people up in Anchorage tried to put together some information. And again, some of the cruise line studies have been presented at IMO, but still a lot of work going on. So I think internationally, IMO wants to see more data. Was what I think I heard last week, but definitely concerned because there are elements that could be toxic. It's like on the wastewater though too, that's why it's monitored. Try to make sure it's not too much in one spot, and that's where the regulatory side comes in.
Federal government also mandating lower or raising the quality standards for our water.
Isn't the federal government at the same time raising quality standards for water?
There's a different process, I believe, for the water quality standards, but I think as they said, and I haven't finished reviewing the new national standards, but they mention more best available technology, which is different than we've done in Alaska on like sewage, where it's based, the bacteria limit for sewage is based on consumption of raw shellfish in state water. So if you're going out there, so it's a direct to human health type relationship, and that's where our limits are so strict. The EPA limits, from what I've read, I haven't finished reviewing them, they mention best available technology. So what the technology is available for, but they originally designed them to be protective, but that's been debated, I think.
I have a question, and that is, does the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on the Chevron doctrine look likely to impact enforcement on the federal or even on the state level regarding standards mechanisms? And yeah.
I don't know on this Vita, they're going by what the law specified, which on some of these was best available technology. But I know I haven't heard the results. I don't know how they would impact state on the Chevron. So the Chevron was about in the past, and I ran into this once or twice, I think, on our DEC permits. When we'd issue a permit, was the courts apparently would look at the regulatory agency as sort of the experts, going, okay, you guys sort of know what you're doing, you make mistakes, but and if that goes away, yeah, it's a definite, I know, concern on greenhouse gases, on air emissions, not just specific to shipping, but everything else. And I don't know if we know what the ramifications of that decision would be.
We have two more questions. We'll do our best to keep them brief, and we're going to leave things there. In the back.
So with the cruise ship industry, it's greater kind of like idea of having liquid natural gas as the main fuel for cruise ships by 2050. That would be 26 years.
So CLIA, let me just repeat that. So CLIA and the cruise ships have a stated goal of using LNG as their primary fuel for cruise ships by 2050 in 26 years.
Gas emission production, how would that compare to, say, for a place like Juneau, where we got maybe like 5 ships in a day, reducing that to 4 ships a day?
how, might have to do some math for that, but,
Yeah.
how would that change to a different, cleaner fuel by all the ships compare to a reduction in, say, one ship per day in Juneau now, reducing the limit from 5 to 4? What would the contrast in greenhouse gas emissions? be?
Yeah, and I don't have the numbers on that. I'm not really an expert. I know there's also other things that they're looking for. And I think beyond LNG, there seems to be some movement on other alternatives. For shipping in general, people are looking at some other things, but yeah, it's a major issue right now. And if you look at LNG, I know the difficulties engineering wise on board. It takes up a lot of space or safety precautions, things like that. So I think you'd have to look beyond the data that we have really on that. We've just sort of more looked at generalities and where regulations are going, not as much on the specifics. Unfortunately, couldn't really, I think, answer that question.
Mhm.
Answer that question is it would be about the same.
The answer to that question is that it would be about the same.
Or the same mission for the ship. Steve Benke brandished a paper from a well-known nonprofit organization. I have one from another. nonprofit.
We have some references from papers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, this is the print
Mhm.
email I sent. The assembly of the JCOS and half a dozen other people about a variety of factors, technical and economic, that affect the cruise ship industry, primarily having to do with greenhouse gases, based on a calculation that the Lee Foundation did, that the total amount of fossil fuel burned by the ships, all 40 of them for their summertime season mission, is about 200 million gallons of fossil fuel. And that would fill 7 federal buildings. If these were oil tanks, that's the volume of fuel, and the volume, the mass of CO2 greenhouse gas emissions is about 2 million tons.
Mhm.
So that's the magnitude of the invisible, imperceptible problem that the industry inflicts upon us. And that's for ships only. That is not including shoreside activity. Everything from the airplanes that people took to Seattle and Vancouver to the buses and the whale watching is also possible.
That's more than I can repeat into the microphone, I think.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We transcribed some in the chat. I appreciate that. Yes, our time is up for today. I want to say, but I can't stress enough how part of the reason we hold these discussions is not just to one and done this, but to keep this discussion moving in our community, because this is one of the most important discussions we can be having. So I hope that rather than considering today conclusive, you will consider today a reason to continue talking about this, continue learning about it, continue seeking out sources, and follow the work being done here. Thank you very much for caring about this, for being here tonight. And thank you very much to our guests and their preparation. Thank you for answering our questions. And thanks to those of you on the Zoom here as well. Our next sustainability session is going to be on food waste, ways to manage it, ways to deal with it in a personal household, including some guests to talk to us about that from different both private and public and nonprofit resources who can tell us a little bit about that in a very kind of concrete, practical way. Do we have a date for that yet? First week of December is what we're looking at. And if you want to know about that, you can add your name to our JCOS listserv to get an email notification about it. If you're in the chat and you care to put your email into the chat, I think we can write it on the listserv there and get it entered. Thank you again so much. Let's give the library back to the librarians. Thank you.
So, thanks for the question. I don't think I've seen the study. Greenhouse gas.
And
Which is hard to do.
what they talk about at IMO is airlines and hotels. Yeah.